There comes a moment in the dynamic between an avoidant person and someone who has been patiently enduring their patterns when the avoidant suddenly realizes something that fundamentally shifts their perception of the entire relationship. They realize that you were never the naive, clueless, overly trusting person they believed you to be. You weren't missing their inconsistencies, their mixed signals, their strategic withdrawals, their manipulation disguised as boundaries. You saw everything. You noticed every pattern, recognized every defense mechanism, understood exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. But instead of calling them out constantly, instead of creating drama or demanding explanations for every withdrawal, instead of pursuing them desperately when they pulled back, you chose to observe. You chose to give them space to reveal themselves fully while you gathered information, processed what you were seeing, and made your own quiet assessments about whether this person and this dynamic was sustainable or worth your continued investment. This realization is profoundly unsettling for the avoidant person because it means they never had the control or advantage they believed they had. It means their patterns were transparent rather than mysterious. It means you were making informed choices to stay or tolerate their behavior rather than being too naive to see alternatives. It means they underestimated you completely, mistaking your patience and strategic non-reaction for ignorance or excessive tolerance. The avoidant person built their entire approach to the relationship on the assumption that you didn't fully understand what was happening, that they were operating at a level of sophistication you couldn't perceive, that their defenses were subtle enough to escape your notice. Discovering that you saw through everything, that you were consciously choosing your responses rather than reacting from ignorance, forces them to reevaluate the entire relationship and their role in it. They realized that every time they thought they were successfully creating distance or maintaining control, you were allowing it while taking mental notes. They realized that the relationship continued not because you were too attached to recognize dysfunction, but because you were giving them enough rope to either change or hang themselves with their own patterns, what you were actually doing while they thought you were clueless. While the avoidant person believed you were naive or simply didn't notice their patterns, you were actually engaged in a sophisticated process of observation, assessment, and strategic response that they completely misread as ignorance or excessive tolerance. You were doing the work that emotionally intelligent people do in relationships with complex dynamics, gathering data, testing hypotheses, noting patterns, and making informed decisions about how much to invest and how long to stay based on comprehensive understanding rather than on blind hope or attachment-driven denial. The avoidant person's assumption that you didn't see what was happening reveals more about their own defenses and their need to believe they were in control than it reveals about your actual awareness. What you were doing while they thought you were clueless was noticing everything. You noticed when their enthusiasm would surge and then suddenly evaporate without explanation. You noticed the pattern of them pursuing when you pulled back and withdrawing when you showed interest. You noticed how they would be warm and engaged one day and cold and distant the next, with no apparent external reason for the shift. You noticed how they spoke about past relationships with a consistent theme of others being too needy or too demanding. You noticed how they maintained escape routes in conversations about the future, always hedging, always keeping things ambiguous. You noticed how they framed their limitations as preferences and their avoidance as healthy boundaries. You were noticing these patterns not in the explosive, reactive way the avoidant person might have expected if they knew you were aware, but in the quiet, accumulating way that creates comprehensive understanding. You were building a mental map of their defensive structure, seeing how the pieces fit together, recognizing the underlying wounds that drove their behavior. You were reading psychology articles about attachment theory, recognizing their patterns in the descriptions of avoidant attachment, understanding that what you were experiencing was not unique to your relationship, but rather a well-documented phenomenon with predictable trajectories. What you were also doing was testing their patterns to see if your observations were accurate. You would occasionally pull back to see if they would pursue, confirming the dynamic where your unavailability triggered their interest. You would express a need to see if they could meet it or if they would withdraw, confirming their limited capacity for responding to others' needs. You would create opportunities for them to show up more fully to see if they would take those opportunities or if they would retreat from them. These tests weren't manipulative games. They were data gathering exercises that helped you understand whether the patterns you were seeing were consistent and therefore likely to continue, or whether they were temporary reactions to specific circumstances that might change. While gathering this data, you were also managing your own emotional responses with considerable sophistication. You recognized that reacting to every withdrawal with anxiety or pursuit would only reinforce their patterns and give them justification for their belief that you were too needy or demanding. You understood that constant confrontation about their inconsistency would trigger their defenses and likely accelerate their exit rather than creating meaningful change. So, you chose strategic non-reaction, responding to their patterns with measured calm that gave you time to think clearly about what you were seeing rather than reacting from wounded attachment. This non-reaction was not the same as acceptance or approval of their behavior. You were not okay with their patterns, but you recognized that showing them you weren't okay in reactive emotional ways would not produce the outcomes you wanted. Either they would use your emotional reactions to justify their withdrawal, framing you as too intense or unstable, or they would provide temporary reassurance that wouldn't translate into sustained behavioral change. So you chose a different approach, allowing their patterns to play out fully while you observed, neither rewarding the patterns with pursuit nor punishing them with drama, simply noting what was happening and what it revealed about their capacity. What you were also doing during this observation period was maintaining your sense of self and your connection to your own reality. The avoidant person's behavior could have made you doubt your perceptions, convinced you that you were reading too much into things or being too sensitive or expecting too much. But you trusted what you were seeing. When they said they cared about you, but their actions didn't demonstrate care, you believed their actions over their words. When they claimed to want the relationship but consistently behaved in ways that prevented intimacy, you recognized the discrepancy. You didn't gaslight yourself into accepting their preferred narrative. You held on to your truth about what you were experiencing. This trust in your own perceptions while maintaining outward calm was sophisticated emotional work that the avoidant person completely missed. They saw your lack of constant confrontation as evidence that you didn't notice the problems or didn't care enough to address them. They interpreted your strategic patience as naive tolerance. They mistook your careful observation for oblivious acceptance. This misreading allowed them to feel comfortable continuing their patterns because they believed you weren't sophisticated enough to see through them or strong enough to leave despite them. What you were also doing was giving them genuine opportunity to change or to reveal whether change was possible. By not reacting to every withdrawal with panic or demands, you created space for them to potentially recognize their own patterns and choose to show up differently. By staying calm and grounded, you modeled secure attachment that could have helped them feel safer if they were capable of learning from that modeling. By maintaining clear boundaries without constant drama, you demonstrated what healthy relationship behavior looked like. You gave them every chance to rise to meet you in healthier dynamic, not because you were naive about the likelihood of change, but because you wanted to know definitively whether change was possible before making your final decisions about the relationship. Throughout this entire process, you are also preparing yourself for the likely outcome. You recognize that avoidant patterns are deeply entrenched and rarely change without sustained therapeutic work that most avoidants never undertake. You knew that observation period would probably confirm that this relationship couldn't provide what you needed and that you would eventually need to leave. But you wanted to be certain, wanted to give the relationship and the person every fair chance, wanted to leave with no regrets about not trying hard enough or not understanding clearly enough. Your observation wasn't about naively hoping they would change. It was about thoroughly understanding what you were dealing with so that when you made your decision to stay or leave, That decision would be informed and confident rather than reactive and uncertain. The moment they realized you saw everything, the avoidant person's realization that you were never naive, that you saw and understood everything all along, typically arrives in a specific moment or interaction that suddenly reveals the gap between how they perceived you and who you actually are. This moment of recognition is often shocking and disorienting for them because it requires them to completely revise their understanding of the relationship and their role in it. They realize they've been operating under false assumptions that gave them a sense of control and superiority that never actually existed. The moment of realization can happen in various ways, but the common thread is that something you say or do demonstrates such clear understanding of their patterns that they can no longer maintain the fiction that you were oblivious. One common trigger for this realization is when you finally articulate their patterns with such precision and clarity that they recognize you've been seeing everything all along. Perhaps after months of their hot and cold behavior, you calmly state, "I've noticed that every time we get closer, every time I share something vulnerable or we have particularly connected time together, you create distance within the next few days. You either pick a fight, suddenly get very busy, or find reasons why we're not compatible." This pattern has repeated at least 8 times in the 6 months we've been together, and it happens so consistently that I can now predict it before it occurs. I understand this is your way of managing anxiety about intimacy, but I can't continue in relationship where closeness is consistently punished with withdrawal. This kind of statement, delivered with calm clarity rather than emotional accusation, is devastating to the avoidant person's perception of the dynamic. You've just demonstrated that you've been tracking their patterns with precision, that you understand the psychological mechanism driving the behavior, that you've been making informed choices about staying despite seeing clearly what was happening. The specificity of your observation, the number of times you've counted the pattern, the prediction that you can now anticipate their behavior, all of this reveals that you've been studying them rather than being confused by them. The calm delivery without emotional reactivity demonstrates that you've processed this information thoroughly and you're operating from clarity rather than from wounded attachment. Another trigger for the realization is when you demonstrate boundaries or make decisions that reveal you were never as invested or dependent as they assumed. Perhaps they execute their typical withdrawal, expecting you to pursue or express anxiety about the distance, and instead you respond with calm acceptance or with your own redirection of energy toward other areas of your life. Or perhaps they return after a period of withdrawal, expecting you to be relieved and immediately receptive, and instead you tell them you've been doing a lot of thinking and you're not sure the relationship is sustainable, that you need to see sustained change before you're willing to continue investing. This response reveals that you weren't desperately waiting for them to come back, that you used the distance to evaluate the relationship rather than to pine for them, that you have standards and limits they didn't realize existed. The avoidant person realizes that their absence didn't have the effect they unconsciously expected. Instead of making you more anxious and more grateful for their return, it gave you space to gain perspective and recognize that you deserve better. This recognition forces them to see that you were more independent and less attached than they believed, that you've been making strategic choices rather than simply reacting to their patterns. Sometimes the realization comes when you reference specific moments or patterns in ways that reveal you were consciously noting them at the time, even though you didn't react visibly. Perhaps in a later conversation, you say something like, "Remember 3 months ago when I mentioned wanting to plan a trip together and you suddenly became very distant for 2 weeks? I understood at the time that the idea of future planning triggered your anxiety, which is why I didn't push it, but I also noted that as important information about your capacity for commitment." This casual reference to a specific incident and your real-time understanding of it, despite not having confronted them about it at the time, reveals that you've been maintaining a mental record of their behavior and its meanings. The avoidant person often experiences this realization with a mixture of emotions. There's shock at discovering they completely misread you and the situation. There's embarrassment at recognizing their patterns were transparent rather than subtle. There's discomfort at losing the sense of control and superior understanding they believe they had. There's respect or even attraction toward your demonstrated emotional intelligence and strategic thinking, qualities they value even as those qualities threaten them. And there's fear about what your clear understanding means for their ability to continue the patterns that make them comfortable. This moment of realization also often includes the avoidant person recognizing that many of their strategies were ineffective because you saw through them. The breadcrumbing was recognized as breadcrumbing. The mixed signals were understood as defensive ambiguity. The withdrawal was identified as fear rather than as legitimate need for space. The criticism and devaluation were seen as protective mechanisms rather than as accurate assessments. Every strategy they employed to maintain control and distance was operating on the surface level while you were operating on a deeper level of pattern recognition and psychological understanding. This recognition means they can no longer use these strategies effectively because the illusion of their subtlety has been destroyed. The realization is particularly powerful because it forces the avoidant person to confront that you are making informed choices to stay and to tolerate their behavior rather than staying out of ignorance or inability to leave. This means your eventual decision to leave, if you make that decision, cannot be dismissed as you finally seeing the light or recognizing what was there all along. You saw it from the beginning. You chose to stay anyway, giving them opportunity to change. And now you're choosing to leave based on comprehensive evidence that change isn't happening. This informed choice is far more definitive and harder for them to argue with than a decision based on sudden realization or emotional reaction. Why your silence was more powerful than confrontation. Your choice to observe rather than to constantly confront, to remain strategically silent about what you were seeing rather than to create ongoing drama about every pattern and inconsistency was far more powerful than the alternative approach of constant confrontation and emotional reaction would have been. This strategic silence served multiple functions that protected you, gave the avoidant person fair opportunity to change, and ultimately created conditions where your eventual decisions and statements would carry maximum impact. Understanding why silence was more powerful reveals sophisticated emotional intelligence that the avoidant person completely underestimated until they realized what you've been doing. The first reason your silence was powerful is that it prevented you from becoming the problem in the avoidant person's narrative. If you had confronted every withdrawal with anxiety and pursuit, if you had created emotional scenes about their inconsistency, if you had demanded explanations and reassurances constantly, the avoidant person would have focused on your reactions rather than on their patterns. They would have framed you as too needy, too demanding, too emotional, too unstable. Your behavior would have become the justification for their withdrawal, allowing them to avoid examining their own patterns by making you the problem that needed to be managed or escaped. By remaining calm and not providing dramatic reactions for them to point to, you force the avoidant person to confront their patterns without the convenient distraction of your emotional reactivity. If issues arose in the relationship, they couldn't be blamed on your excessive responses because your responses were measured and reasonable. If they withdrew, they couldn't justify it by claiming you were smothering them because you were giving them space. If the relationship felt uncomfortable to them, they had to sit with the possibility that their own discomfort with intimacy was the problem rather than blaming your behavior for creating pressure they needed to escape. Your silence also preserved your dignity and self-respect in ways that constant confrontation would have eroded. Every time you chose not to pursue when they withdrew, you maintained your sense of self-worth and your boundaries. Every time you observed their patterns without demanding explanations or reassurances, you demonstrated that you didn't need them to validate your perceptions or to make you feel secure. Every time you stayed calm in the face of their inconsistency, You proved to yourself that you could maintain your center even when someone else was behaving in destabilizing ways. This preservation of self is powerful because it means you emerge from the relationship stronger rather than diminished, clear rather than confused, confident rather than destroyed. The strategic silence also gave the avoidant person genuine opportunity to show up differently without the pressure that constant confrontation creates. When you confront avoidant patterns constantly, you trigger the very defenses you're trying to address. The avoidant person feels pressured and attacked, which activates their need to create distance and their defensiveness about their behavior. But when you remain silent while observing, you create space where change could happen organically if the person were capable of it. Your silence said, I'm giving you room to recognize your patterns and choose differently without making every moment a confrontation about what you're doing wrong. This generous space meant that if they didn't change, you knew definitively that change wasn't possible under even the most favorable conditions. Your silence was also powerful because it was not passive acceptance, but active choice. You weren't silent because you didn't know what to say or because you were afraid of confrontation. You were silent because you consciously chose observation and data gathering over reactive confrontation. This intentional quality to your silence meant you were in control of your responses rather than being controlled by their behavior. You were choosing how to engage rather than simply reacting to what they did. This control is power that the avoidant person didn't recognize you had until they realized you'd been making strategic choices all along. The silence accumulated power over time in ways that individual confrontations never could. Each instance of you noting their pattern without reacting, each moment of you seeing through their defenses without calling them out, each choice to stay calm while they enacted their dysfunction. All of these accumulated into comprehensive understanding and documented record of their behavior. When you eventually chose to speak, when you finally articulated what you've been seeing, the accumulated weight of all those observations gave your words devastating impact. You weren't reacting to a single incident. You were presenting a comprehensive case built on months of evidence. And this comprehensive case was impossible to dismiss or minimize. The silence was also powerful because it revealed who the avoidant person truly was, rather than who they might have performed, being if they'd known you were watching critically. When people know they're being observed and evaluated, they often modify their behavior to create a better impression. But because the avoidant person believed you weren't critically observing, they showed you their authentic patterns without the self-awareness or modification they might have employed if they'd known you were taking notes. They revealed their true capacity, their actual patterns, their genuine limitations, all while believing you weren't sophisticated enough to recognize what you were seeing. This authentic revelation gave you accurate information that you wouldn't have gotten if they'd known to perform better. Your silence also protected you from the exhaustion that constant confrontation creates. Addressing every pattern, every withdrawal, every mixed signal would have consumed enormous amounts of emotional energy and would have made the relationship even more difficult than it already was. By choosing your battles, by staying silent about individual incidents while observing the larger patterns, you preserved your energy for the bigger decisions and conversations that actually mattered. You weren't worn down by constant conflict, which meant when you did choose to speak or to leave, you had the energy and clarity to do so powerfully. The power of your silence is also evident in how it positioned you when you finally chose to speak, because you hadn't been constantly confronting their patterns, because you hadn't been pursuing or creating drama. Your eventual articulation of what you'd been seeing carried enormous weight. The avoidant person couldn't dismiss it as more of your usual emotional reactions because it wasn't usual. It was the first time you were laying out comprehensively what you'd been observing, and the calm precision with which you did so was shocking and undeniable. Your silence had been gathering power, and when you finally released that power through clear articulation of their patterns, the impact was devastating to their perception of the dynamic and their sense of control. What changes when they discover they never had the upper hand? The avoidant person's discovery that you were observing everything all along, that you were never as naive or unaware as they believed, fundamentally changes the dynamic and their perception of both you and the relationship. This discovery shatters several key assumptions they were operating under, and the recalibration that follows this shattering reveals new truths about the relationship's actual power dynamics and future possibilities. Understanding what changes when they realize they never had the upper hand illuminates both how relationships with avoidance function and what happens when the illusion of their control is destroyed. The first major change is that the avoidant person can no longer maintain the comfortable belief that you're too attached or too invested to leave. One of the ways avoidants maintain their sense of safety in relationships is by believing they're the less invested party, the one who could leave at any time, the one who has more power because they need the relationship less. Your apparent naivety or tolerance of their patterns confirmed this belief. If you were naive enough not to see what they were doing, you must be invested enough to accept whatever they offered. But discovering that you saw everything means you were making informed choices to stay, which means you could also make an informed choice to leave. This recognition strips away their sense of security that comes from believing you're more trapped in the relationship than they are. This loss of perceived power often triggers anxiety in the avoidant person that manifests in various ways. Some avoidants respond with increased pursuit, suddenly demonstrating more interest and investment as they recognize you might actually leave.